All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review. This will be our last review session in Tractate Gitin. We are finishing the tractate at the end of this weekend. Monday will be our last day in this tractate. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. This is My Jewish Learning TV. And so we will have a siyum on Monday. I've forgotten the time. I'm going to look it up and I will tell you at the end of this session. But in the meantime, let me introduce Dr. Yardena Osman to steer us around the last week of Dapim in Daf Yomi.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you. Missed last month and excited to finish up this Masechah with you. Normally, when I teach these, I sort of jump around from daf to daf, but I want to do something a little bit different this time because there's a really great passage that I think just gives us a lot of good information about Tanaim and stuff like that. And I want to say a special, you might hear I'm getting people out of here. I'm actually working as a camp doctor this month in Camp Mosheva, so it's a little bit tight quarters and I'm quickly getting my family out of here. Okay, so apologies for the background noise. So we're going to start with the last parak, and I want to look at the Mishnah of the last parak, and it says as follows: Hamigarish et ishto v'amar la harei at muteret l'chol adam ela lipkloni. So our parak begins with the following Mishnah: somebody divorces his wife, and the get that he gives her when he hands it to her says, "You are permitted to any man." And we know that that's kind of at the end later on in our parak. We're actually going to learn that that is essentially sort of the key sentence to a get, right? The idea that the husband in the get basically says that the wife is now allowed to any man. She can marry anybody she wants, except for one person. Right now, I don't know about you, but I have sort of been disturbed. It was kind of shocking for me to see in this Masachet that there is actually a series of what we would basically call conditional gets, right? You have to pay me a certain amount of money. You can't marry this person. We did see a series of these, and this is the type of conditional get that kicks off this particular parak, right? So basically the husband is saying, you can marry anybody you want except for one particular person. Rabbi Eliezer matir, so Rabbi Eliezer says that this is okay. V'chachamim osrim, and the rest of the rabbis say, nope, this is not an acceptable get. And so the question becomes, ketzad yaseh? In other words, what should we do to make this an acceptable get? Excuse me. What do we do to make this an acceptable divorce? Yitlenu heimenu v'yachsor v'yitnenu la v'yomer la harei at muteret l'chol adam. He basically has to take the get from her, hand it to her again. It's interesting. He doesn't necessarily, he has to hand it to her again. So it's not that this was necessarily written in the get itself. This seems to be a verbal thing that he says to her. V'omer la harei at muteret l'chol adam. And then he has to repeat again that you are basically, you are mutar to everybody. You are allowed to marry anyone you want. Kitavo b'tocho. Let's say he wrote it in the actual get itself. Afal pisha chazar mechako pasul. Even if he goes and erases it, it's not considered to be a valid get. And it's actually considered to be an invalid get. Excuse me. So we have this very interesting machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis about this type of conditional get. And Rabbi Eliezer basically says that even if the husband verbally says to her, you are, you can be married to anybody except one particular person, he allows this type of divorce. The rabbis say no. He basically has to re-give it to her without the verbal condition. And if it's written inside the get, it is considered to be pasul. What happens on 83, right, on Daf Pei Gimel, is a very interesting discussion around Rabbi Eliezer. So I just want to get to that particular passage. And the Gemara tells us the following. Let me just get to it. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan. So it's going to go through a very, very long brisa here. Now, remember, a brisa is another form of Tanaitic literature, right? Some people consider it sort of like a Mishnah that didn't make it. That's not always exactly true. And it says the following. La'achar p'tirato shel Rabbi Eliezer. After Rabbi Eliezer died, nichnesu arba'a zakenim lahashiv al devarav. 4 sages came and they wanted to refute this particular opinion of his, right? That in this case, this would be considered to be an acceptable get, having a conditional get. right? And who were they? Eluhain, Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva. So four of our very famous, well, actually five of our very famous Tannaitic friends find ourselves in this particular brisa. So let's just spend a little bit of time talking about who these people were in particular. And then we're going to go through the brisa together to see how each of them refute Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Was it okay for them to refute Rabbi Eliezer's opinion? And do we accept their refutation? So Rabbi Eliezer is a second generation Tana. He tends to represent the school of Beit Shammai. And his counterpart is sort of Rabbi Yehoshua. Those were the two greatest sages, the two greatest Tanaim, I think, or leaders, one could say, of the second generation of the Tanaim. Rabbi Eliezer is Beit Shammai. Rabbi Yehoshua is Beit Hillel. The very famous story about Rabbi Eliezer, we see in our Mishnah that he is an opinion that is contrary to the rabbis, is the famous Gemara in Bava Metzia. If I'm remembering correctly, I think it's on page 54 of the Tanur Shel Aknai, the oven of Aknai, which was a very famous disagreement between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. This particular oven was an oven that could become impure, could become tameh or not become impure. And they have this whole discussion back and forth between the two of them. And the person who really speaks out against Rabbi Eliezer is Rabbi Yehoshua, because what Rabbi Eliezer does is to prove his point that he's correct, is he calls upon nature to sort of give all of these different types of miracles. So, for example, he asks a river to, for its stream to its current to go backwards. The walls of the Beit Midrash start to cave in. And that's where we have the famous passage where Rabbi Yehoshua declares to him, Lo bashamayim hi, right? And even a bat kol comes out, like a heavenly voice comes out and says, Rabbi Eliezer is correct. And Rabbi Yehoshua says, Lo bashamayim hi, right? That the halacha does not get decided by the heavens, it gets decided by the people. And we actually have to follow what the majority say. Now, what happens is that afterwards, Rabbi Eliezer actually gets put in cherem. He's excommunicated because he will not listen to the rabbis and continues to argue with them. And so part of what makes this brisa so fascinating is that even though he was excommunicated, and there are many Gemaras that talk about this, what actually happened when he died and how his students actually came to visit him before he passed away, even though he remained in this state of cherem, of excommunication for the rest of his life. It's interesting to see that the four rabbis of the next generation, the third generation, were not willing to publicly refute what he had taught until he actually passed away. And I think this teaches us something interesting, that even though Rabbi Eliezer had to spend the rest of his life in a state of excommunication, there was a certain respect that these other Tanaim had for him, that it was not that his Torah was wrong, right? That's not what anybody would say. His Torah had tremendous value, but the actions that he took did not allow the system of rabbinic Judaism to sort of behave in the way that it needed to, right? That in other words, we have to follow the majority. And that's why Rabbi Eliezer went into excommunication. So who are the four rabbis who want to challenge his position after he died? Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva. So let's just talk a little bit about each of them. So Rabbi Yossi Haglili is mentioned very often in the Mishnah. Again, these are all third generation Tanaim. He's interesting because he is very much associated with where he's born, right? He was obviously from the Galil. It's interesting about him. I'll just notice that there's a very famous passage in Bereshit Rabbah in the Agadah of the rabbis on Genesis, which actually talks about that his wife was not a particularly pleasant woman, and he actually got divorced. But later on, his wife remarried, and she and her second husband were very poor, and Rabbi Yossi Haglili actually supported them. So that we probably could do a whole class just on that. Rabbi Tarfon. So Rabbi Tarfon was a Kohen. He was very, very wealthy, actually. And the famous story about Rabbi Tarfon is that during a time of famine, he actually married 300 women so that he could feed them truma as a way of supporting them. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah is famous from our Haggadah. He became the Nasi. He became the head of the yeshiva at the age of 18 because of a fight between Rabban Gamliel II and Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabban Gamliel II, this is when the sages are now in Yavna. They're no longer in Yerushalayim. And Rabban Gamliel, in order to assert his authority, had a series of interactions with Rabbi Yehoshua that the people did not necessarily, the other rabbis and students in the yeshiva did not think he was treating Rabbi Yehoshua respectfully. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah becomes the Nasi at age 18. And the very famous passage there, this is a Gemara in Brachot on page 27b to 28a, where his wife actually says to him, "You're too young for this job." And overnight, it says that his beard became gray, grew 18 rows of white hair. And that's why in the Haggadah, in that very famous passage of the rabbis talking, when they stay up all night learning in Bnei Brak, he says, "Ani kiven shivim shana." It's like I'm 70 years old. He had the appearance of a 70-year-old, but he was not actually 70. And then finally, we have Rabbi Akiva. I think is probably the most famous of all of these sages, right? I always like to describe Rabbi Akiva as the eternal optimist, right? He always, but the thing about Rabbi Akiva, and we're going to see that in this particular passage, he brings a creativity to halachic interpretation that we had never seen before. He is really, really innovative in how he does halachic interpretation. Okay, so let's go through exactly what they have to say about Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Okay, Nane Rabbi Tarfon v'Amar. So Rabbi Tarfon responds to Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Remember, this happens after Rabbi Eliezer is actually dead. Haresha halachazo v'niseit la'achiv shel zeh shene'esra alav. So let's say the husband said the wife can't marry a certain man, and she goes and marries the brother of that man, right? So let's say the husband says, you're divorced, but you can't marry Reuven, right? And she goes ahead and she marries Shimon, who is Reuven's brother, okay? Umit below banim. And then Shimon dies, right, without children. Now we know, because we've learned Masachet Yevamot together, that the halacha would be that what? She actually now needs to marry Reuven, right, in order to have a child in the name of Shimon, right? Lo nimsa ze oker davar min haTorah, right? Then the first husband is basically found uprooting, right, a matter of Torah, because her original husband, the husband who made the stipulation, has now made it that the mitzvah of Yibum is not allowed to be fulfilled because she cannot actually marry Reuven because that was a stipulation of her divorce. Halamadzatas she'ein ze kritut, right? So we learn from this that therefore this is not an act of severance. And we know this is the word kritut that is used to describe what the get needs to be in the Torah and the passage in Devarim that describes what a get is. And the idea is that there has to be complete severance. There can be no relationship. There's no connection anymore between the husband and the wife after they have a divorce. So Rabbi Tarfon's point is that if she is prohibited, right, if the husband's brother, her second husband's brother, is prohibited from fulfilling the mitzvah of Yibum with her because of this stipulation, right? This isn't kritut. It's not complete severance. She no longer has agency to do exactly what she wants to do or what she needs to do. And in fact, this is so bad, right? Look at the language he uses here. Lo nimsa ze oker davar min haTorah. Okay? We see that actually what? That this uproots something in the Torah. The stipulation is so bad that it actually has the potential to uproot a basic mitzvah that you need to fulfill from the Torah. So that's Rabbi Tarfon's argument. Nane Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Rabbi Yossi Haglili comes and he says, "Ba'amar heichan matzanu asur lazeh umitar lazeh." Do we have an example where something is forbidden to one person but is permitted to another person? Right? Asur lakol. If something is forbidden, it should be forbidden to everybody. V'hamutar mutar lakol. And if something is permitted, it should be permitted to anyone. So again, this goes against Rabbi Eliezer's opinion that this divorcee could be prohibited to one person, but be permitted to marry everybody else. Rabbi Yosef says this doesn't make sense. Either you're asur or you mutar. Halamadata she'ein ze kritut. So again, he says this shows that this type of divorce with this type of stipulation, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's not full kritut. It's not a full severance. There's still a relationship between this husband and wife after their divorce. Nane Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah comes and he tries to give a refutation. Va'amar kritut. So he's quoting the pasuk, right? It says it has to be a get kritut, a scroll of severance, right? Davar hakaret beino lebeina. So this means it has to be something that severs the bond between him and her entirely, right? And the point is, right, he doesn't even need to come up with something else. He says it just doesn't fit the definition of what kritut is. They still have a bond with each other. Who she marries is impacted by, or is dependent on what the husband stipulated, right? This condition that he gave when he gave the get. So he says, this is not kritut. It doesn't fit the definition of the word of kritut. Now we get to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is going to give us a very, it's almost like convoluted what his reputation is going to be. Nane Rabbi Akiva v'amar. Rabbi Akiva comes, and this is the answer he gives. Harei shehalachazo, right? If after, right, shehalacha v'niseit lachad min hashuk. So if after the husband says that the wife can't go and marry a certain man, and she goes and she marries lachad min hashuk, she goes and marries somebody, what this means is like from the public, right? She finds somebody, she gets married. V'hayula banim, and she has children with the second husband. V'nitz arma od nitz grasha. And then she is widowed or divorced from the second husband. And then let's say she goes and for her third marriage, she marries the man that was forbidden to her by her first husband on that conditional get. Lo nimse get batel ubaneha mamzerim. So logically, wouldn't that make her children from the second marriage, right? Wouldn't that make the get to be batel? She didn't listen to the conditions of the first get, even though there's another marriage in between it, right? She now is released from that second marriage, because either she was widowed or divorced. Is she still going to be, if she's still bound to that condition from the first marriage, right? Then basically and she goes ahead and marries the man who the first husband said you're not allowed to marry, that basically makes that divorce invalid. And then therefore, the children from that second marriage from which she was just widowed or divorced become mamzerim. Remember, we tend to translate a mamzer as a bastard. It's a terrible, terrible translation. But what it is that it's essentially, you do not have a full status of being able to marry within the Jewish people, right? It's like you were born of a not valid union, okay, of a not kosher sexual relationship. So the classic case is, and this is the case here, it would be adultery, right? A child born of adultery is considered to be mamzer. They can only marry another mamzer. So he says it's not severance. If even after she has a full other second marriage, her third marriage is dependent upon the stipulation from the first marriage, this is not full severance. And therefore, how could Rabbi Eliezer allow this to be? He comes up with another one, Rabbi Akiva. Davar acher, haresha yazesh and asra alav kohen. Let's say that the person who the first husband made her forbidden to was a kohen. Umeit hamigaresh. And then let's say, right, her ex-husband who divorced her, right, this first husband who divorced her, who said, you can't marry this kohen, he dies, right? Lo nimseit almana etzlo. Isn't she considered to be a widow with him, right? Because she was considered a married woman, right, with regard to this priest. In other words, she still was forbidden to this particular priest. So there was kind of the status of her being married after her divorce, right? Ugrusha etzel kol adam, but she's considered a divorcee with everybody else. In other words, he's just saying it doesn't really make sense, right? She's sort of, there's still this bond because she still can't marry that man, but she's considered, even though the first husband died, right? Like that stipulation still is there, but still she can't marry anybody who she wants to marry. The kalva homer, and we can make a kalva homer, right? Magrusha shehi kala, just as a divorcee marrying a priest, okay? This is from a passage in Leviticus 21:14. We know that a regular priest is not allowed to marry a divorcee, okay? Is a minor prohibition. Asura bishvil tzad gerushin shava. She's forbidden to this priest because of this divorce, clause that was applied to her, right? Even though, right, with regard to him, but now what? She's not a divorcee. Maybe we could argue that she's a widow, okay, to this Kohen who her husband said she could not marry, right? Esha isha hi chamura lo kol shekain. Okay, even all the more so, right? The prohibition with having a sexual relationship with a married woman is a major prohibition. Shouldn't that apply basically to every man, right? Even during the lifetime of her ex-husband, because she's still considered to be married, right, to this man because he made this stipulation. In other words, he's saying it doesn't make sense that they can still have this connection. Lo kol shekain halamatata she'ein said kritut. So he says that this is not actually kritut. Now, I find Rabbi Akiva's opinion to be interesting because there's something to me that's a little not clean about it. It's almost like it has too many ways to go through it. Like, it's innovative, but it takes a lot of thought to get through it. So they go through the 4 opinions, and then what does the Brisa tell us? Amar lahen Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua says to him, who, remember, Rabbi Yeshua is of the same generation of Rabbi Eliezer, right? They are the ones who sort of represent 2 different sides in that generation. He says, Ein mishivin et ha'ari la'achar mitah. He says, okay, maybe all of your different refutations are valid, right? You all came up with a reason of why this particular get would not be considered to be full kritut. It's not full severance, but one does not refute a lion after his death. And I think this is a beautiful way that Rabbi Yeshua is talking about it, that there was something very intimidating about Rabbi Eliezer. And we see this based on many of the stories that we have about him. He's not warm and fuzzy, okay? If you read about him. In fact, does anybody know who he was married to, Rabbi Eliezer? I'll check the chat. A little trivia question. Okay, Ima Shalom. And who was Ima Shalom's brother? You are correct that it's Ima Shalom. Okay, so Ima Shalom was Rabbi Gamliel II's brother. And when Rabbi Eliezer gets excommunicated, what the Gemara tells us is that she basically wouldn't let him say Tachanun every day because she was worried that he would think bad thoughts about Rabbi Gamliel and cause Rabbi Gamliel to die. Rabbi Eliezer, we see, has like some supernatural powers. When he gets excommunicated, we actually see that like there's the grain crop gets lost, things like that, okay? So, and he actually causes, it's a whole complicated story, but basically she goes to give tzedakah to somebody she thought it was Rosh Chodesh, and it wasn't, and he goes and says Tachanun and Rabbi Eliezer, and then she hears the shofar and knows that the Nasi, the Rabbi Gamliel, actually died, okay? So it's interesting to see sort of all of these relationships, but the point is that Rabbi Yeshua basically comes and he says, no. He had this opinion. Your job after he dies, you are not allowed, the next generation of Tanaim, to actually come and to actually try to uproot what he said. Okay, you cannot come and now give all of these refutations after he died. And I think what Rabbi Yeshua is teaching us here is that there needs to be a certain integrity to what is being taught in the previous generations, right? We recorded it. It's in a Mishnah. This was clearly an important position that we felt was worthy of preserving. So for these 4 Tanaim who are students to come afterwards and say, now that he's dead, when he doesn't have the ability to actually answer or say why each of their refutations might be incorrect, they are not allowed to actually come and to actually refute him. And I found that to be very, very interesting. Okay, we'll do a little bit more. I don't know that we'll have a full amount of time. I'll just check if there are any questions here. Okay. Oh, okay. There's a class with Gila Fine on Ima Shalom. Ima Shalom is one of the most interesting women in the Talmud. So you definitely read up about her. Okay. Amar Rava. So now Rava comes. And remember, Rava is an Amora, okay, living in Bavel. Kulhu I luhu pricha, right? So he says all of these opinions that were mentioned, these 4 opinions that were mentioned, right? They all have, Levar Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, okay? Except for the refutation of Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, the Leisle Pricha does not have a refutation. So what Rava is saying is that all of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Rabbi Tarfon, and Rabbi Akiva, I can refute their refutation. The only one I can't do that to is Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, okay? Tanya Nami Halchi, and then they actually quote a brisa. So remember, we're going from like not only different generations, we're going from different time periods, right? We're now jumping back to the Tanaim. The Gemara says, oh, and we actually have a brisa that taught this as well. Amar Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi taught, we're ani et divrei Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah midivrei kulan, right? I agree that the best refutation of Rabbi Eliezer is actually Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. So the Gemara does something so fascinating here, right? We just had this opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, which says you're not allowed to refute Rabbi Eliezer. And then the Gemara comes, and what does the Gemara do? Okay, but I'm going to tell you whose answer was actually the best. And the best refutation to Rabbi Eliezer is actually Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, right? So in a way, the Gemara is like a little bit ambiguous, about this discussion here, right? They preserve the discussion, right? They give the rebuke of Rabbi Yehoshua in it, but then it's going to continue on with the discussion, okay? And again, just to remind ourselves, what was that opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah? The opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was the only one that didn't bring another case. All the other Tanaim brought a case, right? What if, he made that stipulation and then she married this person, or she got widowed and divorced, or was a Kohen that she wasn't allowed to marry. And then based on that case, they came up with a reason of why this wasn't Kritut. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah has a very simple answer, right? He just says, it's not the definition of Kritut. Kritut means davar hakoreh beino lebeina. It means it totally severs the bond. That's not what I would say is severance. There's still a bond between the two of them. There's a simplicity and a beauty in Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's opinion that I think that's why Rava and Rabbi Yossi come and say, there's nothing that you can refute about it. We have a word in the Torah explaining what the get needs to be. It needs to be a get of Kritut. This is not Kritut. You cannot walk away after this divorce and say there isn't some type of bond between them. What she can do after her divorce is still dictated. Who she can marry, even if it's just one person, right? Only one person, let's say he only banned one person, right? It's still dictated by that previous relationship. And that does not fit Kritut. And so what happens from here on, and I don't know, I don't really have time to get started with it, is basically now they're going to go through all of the opinions again, and then they're going to show how could you refute it? How could you refute the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon? How could you refute the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Haglili? How could you refute the opinion of Rabbi Akiva? And they're basically going to show why all of these are not good opinions, but Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is really the opinion that is best. And so I think we learned a couple of things. I'll just wrap up. I thought we'd have a little bit, well, in my head, we had more time. Okay. But a couple of things. I think this is a fabulous passage. First of all, it just, having all of these sages from different generations interact with each other teaches us a lot. I think it teaches us a lot about not only the respect or sort of the fear that there was around Rabbi Eliezer, but also to see Rabbi Yehoshua, right, who basically, is of the same generation of Rabbi Eliezer, disagrees with him often because he sort of upholds the school of Beit Hillel and basically sort of rebuke the the next generation, say, no. This is not somebody we go through. And then I also think it's interesting to see what are the refutations that are presented, right? Rabbi Akiva sort of in his innovation, it's sort of, this very complex word problem that I had to read a few times to be like, I'm not quite sure I understand what Rabbi Akiva is doing. This seems so convoluted. And then you just sort of have the simplicity of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's opinion, which is just basically saying, it's not Kritut, it's not severance. It doesn't you don't need a case, you don't need another way to prove it, you don't need a kal v'chomer. It's just not severance. There's still a bond between them. Something about her freedom is impaired. She cannot do exactly what she wants to do. And therefore, we cannot consider this to fit the definition of a get Kritut. And it doesn't fit the definition of what a divorce bill needs to accomplish according to the definition of the Torah itself. So I know I'm cutting you short of 1 minute of Torah, and I apologize about that. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'll look at the chat quickly. Okay, so
you've got a hand.
Okay. Oh, I have a hand. Okay, Claudette. I think you need to unmute her, or she can unmute herself.
It's not so much a question as a comment that when I look at this and how much the rabbi appreciated and honored the rabbis before them, and I look at modern day society, how much we destroying what was established and the chaos it is causing in the courts.
Yeah, I think that's a great, I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. And what we do see is that, in other words, these four sages, they thought it was more respectful not to refute him while he was alive. And then Rabbi Yeshua comes and says, actually, it's less respectful to refute him while he's dead because he can't answer. But Claudette, your point is that the point of departure for everybody is the type of respect that we have to have for our teachers and for each other in society and for Torah. And that's really what the point here is. They may have had different ways of viewing it. How do we best express that respect, right? But
we need to bring it into modern day and hold that respect.
right, but the value is one of respectful discourse. And how do we ensure respectful discourse? I think that's a beautiful point. Okay, Eve Kelly Hall says here, it seems like the ultimate case of not presenting arguments against people who can't defend themselves, their argument. But on the other hand, the Talmud has a lot of arguments between rabbis who were not alive at the same time. Yes, I agree with you, but I think the point here is that it was what the Gemara is telling us is the Brisa is that they specifically waited to have this discussion after he died. And I think that is the point they didn't like. But yes, you're right. The Talmud is essentially a collection of discussions that transcends time, right? In other words, an Amora can disagree with a Tana, or two Tanaim from two different generations can disagree with each other. So I totally agree with you, but there was something about the way this was done that made Rabbi Yehoshua deeply uncomfortable. Okay, any other questions or comments? Now we're 2 minutes over.
Thank you, Dr. Asbund. I will add one comment too that you made me think of while I was listening to your presentation. Thank you for picking such a rich passage for us today. Some people know I spent my 20s in the academy, and it occurs to me as I'm seeing this again with you today that at that time, my sense was like the scholarship was really divorced from who wrote it, right? Scholarship was really judged on the merits of the piece itself, and who you were as a scholar mattered much less than what you produced. And that was sort of judged in isolation from you. And it's so interesting, I think, and it feels a little more honest, but also more complex in the Talmud when we really don't divorce the teachings from the people who purvey them and their personalities and their status and their learning and all of those things. And all of that is brought to bear in how we think about it. It makes it a lot more complex, but also a lot more interesting, I think.
I think that's a great point, right? Usually it's sort of like depersonalized. We give the name, we want to attribute who said it, but it's deep, but that's always the beauty of the Gemara is that an Amora can argue with the Tana, right? And here we see it's very personal, right? Like Rabbi Yehoshua is really saying, you cannot do this to your teacher. But again, I think this goes back to, and Laura wrote this, I think you can't learn these passages without understanding the personalities. And, if MJ Elver wants to have me, I'm happy to do a full class on Rabbi Eliezer. When you know the full story of Rabbi Eliezer and how he was ultimately excommunicated, but yet at the end, Rabbi Yeshua's point is saying, like, this wasn't just any rabbi. This was a rabbi who was a teacher who was excommunicated, one of the greatest sages. And so I think that's why Rabbi Yeshua is being even more careful. He's trying, and I want to be clear, when he dies, his students actually treat him with great respect. Rabbi Akiva, actually, there's a beautiful passage where he says when he dies, I wasted basically you being I shouldn't have listened to the excommunication because I lost the opportunity to learn Torah from you. They quickly go to him on his deathbed and say, teach us some Torah. And then Rabbi Akiva realizes he lost out all this time. It's so sad. But Rabbi Yeshua is basically saying, this is like a special case. This was someone who was excommunicated, whose Torah was not allowed to be out there. And so we're not going to refute his Torah. But you don't know that unless you know everything else about Rabbi Eliezer.
Right. And the rabbis didn't produce biographies. So you have to kind of pick up these bits from their lives as you move through the Talmud. And it takes time, I think, to learn who these personalities are, some of whom we know a lot better than others. But Rabbi Eliezer, definitely one of the most colorful, for sure. Okay, we are going to leave it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Asbund. Folks, the siyum that I couldn't remember the time this morning, apologies for the little brain fart, is going to be at 10 a.m. Eastern time on Monday, this Monday, August 14th. Sign-up links and stuff will be in your email, so keep an eye out for that. We'll look forward to celebrating the end of this tractate and moving on then the next day to Kiddushin, which will be our last tractate in Seder Nashim. We will have finished then 3 out of 6 of the orders of the Talmud. So we are moving toward the midpoint here. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for your comments and questions. Thank you, Dr. Asbund, as always, for bringing really interesting passages and illuminating them so clearly and quickly, because we only allot you half an hour here to do so. So we will see you hopefully on Monday at the Siyum in your inbox tomorrow morning, and then for a review class next Thursday morning. Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Looking forward to learning with again soon.
Bye.